Thanks, everybody, for coming to the May Sports and Tech Meetup about investing in sports tech ventures. Really excited to dive into a deep discussion with y'all and the people on the panel. But first, I want to give a big thanks to everyone who put this together. First of all, a big thanks to the awesome folks from Bleacher Report who are providing the food, drink, and venue. Second, big thanks to Sports Radar, who you may have seen out front, who's sponsoring the event. They just launched their esports data API that will provide clients and partners the tools to cover esports in the same manner as you would cover traditional sports. So go over there and learn about APIs and feeds and all the cool stuff you can do with their data. In terms of the next event, we're going to try to do one in July or August. As always, let me know about topics, speakers, etc. I honestly don't really have a plan for that one, so let me know. And finally, do tweet if you're so inclined. The hashtag is sports, SPORTS, and AND tech, TECH. So we can track everything, and if you ask me questions, I'll ask the questions to the panel. And of course, we'll also have an opportunity for you guys to ask questions at the end of the panel. So without further ado, I'd want to introduce our panelists for our panel tonight, Investing in Sports Ventures. From our right to our left, on the right, we have Deepen Parikh. Yeah, all right. He's a partner at Courtside Ventures. He's a venture partner at Interplay Ventures. And he is a fan of the Baltimore Ravens. So a lot of stuff. Lot of stuff to digest there. All right. To his left is Ned Renzi. He's a partner at Birchmere Ventures. He's an angel investor in a bunch of sports tech companies. And he may be running out of this panel a little bit early to get to the Golden State Warriors game, which is an okay excuse in our book. He will be. Okay. To his left is Ethan Kurzweil. He's a partner at Bessemer Venture Partners, who invested in a bunch of sports sort of periphery companies, Twitch, Periscope. He's an investor in the SF City Football Club. And he is a fan of the Red Sox and Patriots with a mild appreciation for the San Francisco Giants, in his words. And to his left is Scot Chisholm. He's the founder and CEO of Classy. He's an investor in a bunch of companies, including FanDuel, as well as being an investor and board member of SF City Football Club. And he's a fan of Liverpool, the Red Sox, the Patriots, and SF City FC as well. So we'll go for a little while, half hour or so, and then we'll open it up to questions from you guys. So just the first question to start this off. So investing in, we've got a bunch of people, at least 3, who are investing out of venture capital funds, and only one of them really invests in direct on sports investments out of their venture capital funds. So I've heard the bull and bear case from other people. So basically, why is that? Let's start with the bears a little bit, I guess. Particularly Ned, who I know invests in a bunch of sports companies on his own. Like, are there structural reasons you're not investing in sports companies at a venture level? I mean, I guess you always hear people don't want to invest in like content companies and gaming companies because there's not predictability. Like, I'm pretty sure people are going to be watching basketball 50 years from now. So what are the structural reasons that hasn't happened yet?
Yeah, so I'd say when you sort of look at venture, there's macro reasons and micro reasons. And I'll start with the micro. So in our partnership, it requires a unanimous vote to make an investment. And I'm the only really sports fanatic in the partnership. So all my partners are not really into sports and don't really understand the size of the market and the opportunities like I think I do. I have the button on. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. So that's sort of the micro reason why it's hard to get investments through the partnership. You know, from a macro standpoint, I think there's a swath of broad market opportunities, things like Bleacher Report, FanDuel, et cetera. But I think a lot of the opportunities in sports tech from a pure venture standpoint are more considered niche opportunities from the traditional venture side. So like if we looked at an enterprise deal or consumer opportunity, you know, the question is how does it get to 500 million revenue or sort of $1 billion revenue? And I think a lot of the sports tech companies solve real problems, but maybe they sort of plateau at 10 million or 50 million or something like that. That's less interesting to traditional venture funds.
All right. Deepen, is that wrong, or do you guys just have different goals for the fund?
No, that's pretty much spot on, actually. So I probably sit on the side of bull and bear case when you think of this. So Courtside is a sports-focused fund. We are not necessarily sports tech only, but we want to invest in companies that have exposure to sports. And so what that means is we may not necessarily invest in only in-stadium apps or, data wearable type companies, but we want to invest where we think we can help accelerate the growth in the sports vertical. So whether it's the primary vertical, secondary vertical, or even the third vertical, we think we can be helpful in kind of accelerating that growth. To his point earlier, I mean, sports is highly, I guess, valued in terms of dollars when you look at franchises, you look at TV deals, media deals. That also means that rights are a huge issue. And as an early stage company, going after rights is something that probably terrifies all of us up here. And so, we're constantly looking for ways where if it's an early stage company, do they have the wherewithal, or how much capital would it take for them to be that $500 million company or that $1 billion company? And so we're trying to think outside the box. I mean, sports, we have some strategic assets. So one of our main LPs is Dan Gilbert from the Cleveland Cavaliers. And so we want to be able to help these companies, whether sports is the main focus for them or is going to be something they go after in ticketing or merchandise or even a streaming platform that could have applicability to sports itself.
Got it. So, Ethan, you had said, I think when we were talking about you being on the panel, like, oh, I don't invest in sports, but like you've invested in some things that, as I said, Periscope, I think the story's still to be told, but I could see there being a sports aspect, and Twitch certainly, if you count esports as sports, it's a very central aspect to it. Yeah, so when you sort of said I don't invest in sports, again, is that a systematic thing about being scared of rights, or is it just like that it hasn't happened yet?
Yeah, I mean, so personally, I do look at sports opportunities like with Scot and Jock, who's in the back, the SF City Football Club. But if you go and sort of take that aside and take my day job as a partner at Bessemer Venture Partners, typically sports has been controlled by rich men and women owning local franchises in each of their cities, right? That's been the typical model, and it has been an extraordinarily profitable venture for those folks that have been able to buy into it at whatever level they were able to buy into it, going back to whatever franchises they controlled. But it's been controlled by the sports owners and those that control the media rights, as was said earlier. And so I haven't seen a thesis. We're as a venture firm, very thesis we call roadmap driven in terms of opportunities we pursue. I haven't found a thesis that would enable a small firm, a small company to kind of have some exponential growth in and around sports itself, given that structural barrier to being a big company. But for something like esports, and I think Bleacher Report probably is the exception that may prove the rule going forward, through user-generated content, through sort of hacking your way around those typical kind of local monopolies that controlled sports, there have been some good opportunities there. Twitch gave people the streaming technology to stream their esports play over the internet to people that wanted to watch it. They didn't ask for permission, and to be perfectly honest, there's probably they probably were on some thin ice in the beginning, but they sort of hacked their way around and just created enough of an audience that people wanted to do it and did it. Periscope's in that same kind of territory, and not really a sports thing, but certainly one of the things that a lot of people are live streaming are sports type activities, sports games, things like that. But again, these things that kind of go backdoor around the opportunity that can avoid some of the local controls that the traditional sports industry has gone after. We do not like things that require lots of upfront investment, even though that's kind of ironic, right? Because we're giving people money, but we want things that we can give them money not because they need it, but because they can go far without it.
Yeah, you're not the first VC to say they want capital-efficient companies, so totally get it. So we've talked about a little bit about like what you don't love. Having said that, you talked about esports as being a potential area of interest. There's a gazillion buzzwords, whatever. DFS, VR, etc. What are the areas that you are interested in potentially investing in that touch this landscape in some way? And I guess we haven't heard from you, Scott, so you can start out.
Well, I didn't directly invest in FanDuel. That was through an acquisition, an esports acquisition, actually. A company called Alpha Draft, which is basically the FanDuel for esports for the most part. There's a couple in the space. And FanDuel took an interest, so I sort of backed my way into that investment. But when they told me that they had sold out the Staples Center for the World of Warcraft championship, I was blown away by that. And then they proceeded to show me a bunch of other stats that showed how it was more popular than pretty much every sport in the United States. So the numbers alone and the traction alone was compelling for that investment. And obviously FanDuel saw something in it too. We'll see what happens with it, but I think the category in general is super interesting, and especially internationally, it's mostly where the fan base is from. So that was one thing that I did. Outside of SF City, I haven't made a ton of sports-related investments specifically, but those two are probably the biggest ones. SF City is really interesting. We've learned a ton about what it takes to basically build a sports franchise from the ground up. So that's been an extreme learning experience and something hopefully we'll be able to carry forward. But that is here in the hometown. I think Jock's in the back with scarves if you're looking to purchase one now. And so that's been a huge learning experience for us, and going back to sort of the franchise zone, like local model.
Cool. We'll talk more about SF City, which is the community-based soccer team that these guys are involved with later. But I'm happy to pass it to any of you guys. Yeah, what touches the space that you think is potentially compelling?
I think the key question is what is the opportunity for technology to improve the sporting experience, or create either on the consumer. For a consumer application, create an audience or excitement or buzz or usage of consumers that transcends one particular league, one particular game, one particular franchise, right? And so esports, that's exciting, right? I mean, Twitch was exciting because it was lots of different platforms interacting in this media the same way that you have, lots of networks on Facebook and lots of people coming together on all the very valuable social internet franchises. So what are the opportunities for technology to enhance sports experience that way? And so is it things like things that create community around sports, things that create community around betting, things that create live viewing experiences, things that report on what are the things that people are doing already that are already happening in the offline world that can be brought online? And so that would be, again, it's not an active area of interest for me so much, but if I were to look at it, I would say, where can technology and the networked nature of the internet create an advantage of and beyond the sort of local media model that we have today? That would be my kind of roadmap for thinking about it.
So for me, I make personal angel investments in sports tech companies, and there, as a former player and coach, my focus is on, I sort of have this thesis that the technology will replace all routine cognitive tasks within a decade. So, whether it's human tasks in the enterprise, consumer, et cetera. And I think when I extend that to sports, I think through machine vision, you're going to have personalized coaching. Like if you have free YouTube videos here for $0 and you have one-on-one coaching here for $100 or $200 per hour, my sense is through machine learning, computer vision, et cetera, coaching will give you, 90% of this one-on-one experience for, 10% of that cost. And so when I sort of look at some of the apps that I've invested in, it's how do you do professional personalized coaching in a more automated machine learning type way.
So our general thesis, since we're an institutional fund and we focus on sports, we kind of boiled it down to investing across the disintermediation of content creation, content consumption, and content distribution as it relates to sports. And so that's pretty broad. Content could be audio, video, esports falls under the same realm, VR. But a couple areas that we're looking at pretty heavily, kind of this democratization of content creation. So I think Ethan earlier said UGC. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for, to cut out a lot of the weight that exists in generating content or filming content in sports, whether that starts at youth, high school, college, D3. There's a big opportunity there and a lot of ways to repurpose that content to other distribution platforms. We're really bullish on the internationalization of sports content. So, You have the likes of Fubo TV or, Flow Sports, which is another one. I read an interesting fact earlier this week that said 30% of the U.S. it consists of millennials, but there's 700 million millennials in India alone of the 2 billion in the world. So as people have not necessarily even more disposable income, but as they have access to a lot more content, we think that's a really large opportunity. And all the major sports leagues here may be really tight on rights as it pertains to the U.S., but they're constantly looking to reach a global audience. Because soccer truly is the one sport that is global, but a lot of the U.S. leagues have a lot of, weight within the rest of the world, but they're constantly looking to increase that. And then finally is probably this, we look really heavily at esports, so really bullish on community-driven viewership, so people moving away from just being content consumers to actual content creators. So instead of just watching a stream, participating in the stream, we think is somewhere there's a big opportunity.
One more thing I just thought of, and it strikes me VR is like a tremendous opportunity to bring a sports experience to more people. I mean, you think most people like watching sports presumably because they want to be immersed, or they enjoy playing as well. They want to be kind of more immersive content. So it strikes me VR, I'm not sure whether it's for playing or coaching or just providing a better fan experience. There probably will be big winners there, specifically as that relates to sports, although I don't think we've seen any yet.
Yeah, it seems like next VR is probably the one that everyone talks about, but TBD. There are a few. And yeah, but please name, I guess, one. If there are other companies in VR that you think are super interesting, I guess, yeah, let's do that as a first question. Yeah, what other companies do you think are super interesting?
So there's NextVR, obviously, that has a phenomenal team and has built out and raised quite a bit of capital. Live Like VR is one that I find to be particularly interesting. The team's really strong, and they have a slightly different model where they're partnering up with a lot of the rights holders as part of their experience, and they have really interesting multiplayer function where you could be as a part of the same experience as someone else who's halfway around the world. You could be watching the same game within the same experience, whether from a suite or from the field. So that's pretty interesting. To Ethan's point, VR, the assumption that someone's going to wear a headset for 3 hours, I think is still pretty silly. The form factor currently is not, that applicable to people on a daily or regular basis. But we're early in the VR game. I mean, as much as we hear about it, it's still absolutely nascent in terms of consumer adoption. And so I think someone that's really interesting, which is not a startup, is actually Sony. Sony has done a really phenomenal job. They have, I think, somewhere close to 50 million PlayStation units out there that have compatibility over to VR. And so they go after gamers, but having something already in market, I think, is really interesting. A lot of people will be able to leverage that platform.
Cool. So one of the other sort of emerging places that we've talked about a little bit is esports that you just mentioned, and Ethan's already obviously invested in. One of the sort of things that it seems like at least venture scale investors like to talk about are platform scale companies, whatever that means.
We don't know either. So.
Yeah, got it. Having said that, right, like it seems like as these industries mature, those opportunities are harder to find. Do you think there are still platform level opportunities in the esports space?
Well, I can start. I mean, it's interesting because as esports has matured, it's actually less interesting as an investment opportunity for me because it's going the route of more established sports franchises where you have rights and you have players highly paid, and you just have less ability to bootstrap your way to a big broad level through kind of quasi user generated content or content that you don't have to pay a lot of money for, whether you consider it professional grade or not. I mean, what was so interesting about Twitch is you had content that people experienced as professional content, but you didn't have to pay for it. It's like imagine that the NFL just gave you rights to all their games with no licensing fees. That was the situation you had there. It's obviously a great venture opportunity because you had an audience, you had great content, but you didn't yet have the established kind of norms around paying for it and all of that. That's changing. That's changed. And so there certainly are probably more opportunities in and around the edges of esports than there are of maybe sports with an established technology ecosystem around them. So I don't want to say there's not a lot of opportunities, but as these things get more and more mature, they get bigger companies get involved, more money is at stake, and it is harder for scrappy technologists to have an impact. And so I think we're somewhere between where the NBA is and in terms of rights and all of that, and where esports came from, and a lot of those gaps are getting filled over the years since this has gone more and more mainstream.
So the way we kind of think about it is Twitch feels like the ESPN, right? Like when it comes to general purpose esports type content, they are the clear winner. The beauty of esports, and I think we all agree, there's a lot of hype around it, and the market size itself, I think the number, correct me if I'm wrong, is like a couple $2 billion by 2020, something like that in terms of size. But I think there's a big opportunity. For the first time, you see people picking a team based on a player, right? So a lot of times, when you look at traditional sports, you see people picking a team and then kind of falling in love with the player, and then maybe if they're really upper echelon, they'll go follow the player to the next team. We're in a completely different dynamic here. And there's actually not as much synergy that exists between, let's say, a CSGO or a League or a Minecraft, right? They're entirely different games, different audiences. So just like there's an ESPN, which is kind of the Twitch, the way we see in esports, we think there's an opportunity for an NFL network, an NBA network, where those properties online may never be as large as Twitch, but they can still get 20, 30 million active users on a fairly regular basis because people are pretty set and have been playing certain titles for an extended period of time.
Cool. All right. So we've got a lot of people. Just raise of hands. How many people here are a part of an early stage sports-related tech company? Okay. So quite a few people. Many of them, for better for worse, seem to want to finance their companies through outside investment. One of the questions, I probably get this email 10 to 20 times, is like, when am I ready? So if you guys can, as sort of tactically as possible, just say, like, it doesn't have to be like, will you get an investment, but what's the right stage to approach you guys to sort of be in your strike zone where it's stage appropriate, whatever that means. So like, I work with a bunch of Series A companies in the like consumer transactional space, and I say, like, if you're not growing 20% month over month and you don't have 150 to 200K of revenue, get there. What's I don't know what about for sports. What's the right answer?
I'm not sure there's a hard rule for it, to be honest. Personally, I do angel investing, but I actually like to invest alongside like a Series A investor or a Series B versus being like the first money in, although I have done that as well. I mean, I think if you're investing in a sports tech company, I think the same rules apply for really any startup company. So team is usually first. The people that are part of the team, their experience, their conviction around the problem they're solving. I always look for a really early stage, like differentiated value. So how are they attacking the problem they're solving? How is it different from something else? So I think that's a big thing. I don't look as much as the venture guys as at the market size. I think for me personally, it's about the problem they're solving, the differentiated value, and the strength of the team. Personally, as far as like the traction and the numbers,
is there metrics that, because I mean that's helpful to say, and I feel like everyone here will say I have a terrific team and a great market. But like what I want to be able to do in this answer is say, okay, like, this is the stage where it makes sense to approach these guys, and I understand there's lots of shades of gray, and this is when it's not, and don't waste your time if you're not in this stage.
For me, it would be post revenue with significant traction, $500 to $1 million in revenue around.
In run rate or something, yeah.
We invest in all stages. I can't give you a good answer to that question. We invest all over the map. I mean, I think what is the question I would have for a sports tech-related venture specifically is like, what's the accelerant to this business? Like, what's the sort of Twitch moment where, like, you're riding some wave of something that's going to make this happen? And, yeah, it'd be a great team and all those other things. But I think there are lots of opportunities in sports, and if you look at all the major success stories of sports, of which Bleacher Report would be in that category, what was the thing that enabled it to happen at that time, right? And so there's social norms around how people interact on the internet. There's technology that enables live streaming. There's the support of the major sports franchises and their willingness to work with companies like you. Like, what is that thing that's going to make this different?
Yeah, so I just start off by saying 99% of all companies should not raise venture. So when you start thinking about fundraising, you should decide, am I going after angel money and then trying to get to break even, or am I, is this a step to get the metrics that I think are fundable at a seed or Series A from an institutional standpoint? And I sort of put them in three buckets. I say hope, vision, data. And I think hope is your first money, and you really don't need anything to raise that. I think when you start getting to the data end of that, when you start talking Series A, it depends on your revenue model. So if your revenue model is subscription-based, probably 1 million to 3 million ARR with low churn and high LTV to CAC ratio and just a whole bunch of subscription metrics. I think if it's e-commerce, then you need an ARPU related to your cost of customer acquisition that sort of makes sense for e-commerce investors.
3 or 4 to 1 or something.
Pardon me?
3 or 4 to 1 or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. And then if you're media, I would defer to these guys because I don't do media, but you'd have to have some level of audience and conversion and stickiness and stuff like that.
The challenge with media is it really doesn't make sense unless you get very, very big. I mean, the premium ad rates don't apply unless you're at tens of millions of viewers in the U.S. And so you have to have a credible path to that. That's a hard road.
So I don't think there's a defining answer to say these are the numbers you need. I think it depends on the business model. So if let's say you're an enterprise business selling to teams, sports teams. I think someone was saying the other day there are 158 pro sports teams in the U.S. that you could possibly sell to. And I believe that includes pro and the top colleges that have the capital to do so. So if you're going after 158 total clients, if you come and you meet with an investor and you say, hey, I'm doing a pilot with this one team, I think that's probably too early, right? I think if you haven't done, or you're just in initial conversations and you haven't spoke to any teams, that's probably too early. But showing a case study makes a world of difference, right? It doesn't mean institutional investors are necessarily going to look at it, mainly because the market size may be too small, but that definitely attracts angels. So if you can show that there is a real reason why a team is going to pay you recurring money for a product or a platform or service that you offer, prove that out first, I think, before you try to go raise any form of institutional capital. From a consumer side, it's all about the business model again. If you're, to Ethan's point, if you're a streaming platform and you're, relying on ads, got to have tens of millions of views. Our biggest barometer, I'd say really early stage, is engaged users, not total downloads. I know a lot of people, when you talk to them early stage, like, hey, I have 100,000 downloads. But what does the daily, weekly, monthly active users look like, which is the most important metric in my mind, just because that shows that people cannot live without your product, especially if it's consumer facing. And so we invest in seed and Series A. We almost always want to see a product in market or at least tested to know that there's a clear demand for the product.
That's interesting. So in term, all right, where are we going here? Okay. So there's been I think we did one of these panels a year or two ago, and we were talking about sports companies getting big. In the last year or two, I think there have been more big checks written for sports tech-related ventures than probably in history. You've had FanDuel and DraftKings, and Fanatics has had big checks for a while, and you've had Huddle, and you've had SeatGeek, and probably a bunch of other companies I haven't even thought of. So it seems like there are some companies getting to interesting scale, like Series C big check scale. Are you guys bullish? But most of them still have not shown investors liquidity and stuff. They're still TBD. Are you bullish on some of these bigger companies? Do you think there are other companies I didn't mention that are going to be whatever you want to call them, world beaters or home runs or whatever. Because, I mean, it seems like that liquidity will just help this space a lot in general.
Yeah, it's hard to, I mean, given the amount of money that gets spent on sports as a category of entertainment, spending, viewership, time, it stands to reason that there will be technology built around that category that generates big companies. I mean, StubHub exited for, I think it was $300 or $400 million to eBay a while back, and that's probably a much bigger business within eBay. There's more recent incarnations of that you mentioned, SeatGeek and Game Time, which is trying to do a mobile experience. So I think, again, I'm not sure on the exact market timing, but the market size is there. And so over the if you take a very long-term view of it, I imagine, I don't know which one, but I imagine some of these companies will be very successful, just given the amount of time, attention, and just given the market. It's so lucrative. But always the traditional hang-up has been, can they work with the status quo of the major players in sports that control those franchises to be successful? And that's changing to some degree. You know, technology is eating things, and you know, I think in the past something like StubHub was resisted, and now you know they're supported by the major players. So that's probably an indication that more of that will happen over time.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think again, if you just look at the business model itself, StubHub and SeatGeek are ticketing. Sports is a component of that. They also have music and a lot of other events. You look at, what else did you mention in terms of Bleacher Report, right? We're here in their office. Bleacher Report is sports focused, but it is a content business, right? It's, you know, highly predicated on advertising and distribution. So at the end of the day, it's not like sports. People always say sports tech, and they think of an in-stadium app, or they think of a fan engagement app. Those are definitely really important because, to Ethan's point, there is a massive, massive fan base around the world in sports fans. But I would stress everyone to think about like companies that have relevancy to sports. Fanatics, again, it is an e-commerce business that has done a phenomenal job of developing relationships with all the different rights holders, right? So I think thinking bigger when it comes to sports, not to say there's not a need for smaller companies, but from an institutional standpoint, I think carries a lot of weight.
Got it. One of the things that you guys had mentioned before, Scott and Ethan in particular, which is part of the reason you're here, Jacques introduced us, is SF City Football Club. Obviously, I don't know if your intentions on that are, you know, to have 100x exit or as much as support community, but whether you're investing sort of time or money, it'd be interesting to hear why you guys got involved in kind of a local football club, because it seems like there's a couple of them now, and yeah, why you chose this one and what that's about.
Jacques, you promised us 100x, right? Is that not? Did I mishear that?
1,000. I think it comes back to Ethan's point about the timing and sort of the unique circumstances. And in soccer in particular, especially the minor league levels, it's a little bit of a free-for-all, and it's still being defined. And so, you know, with Jock and SF City, I think he had unique insight into how to play the game, how to maneuver a team and get it to rise up and give it a shot at being San Francisco's professional team. And that was what initially attracted me to it. And then as I sort of learned and understood the leagues and how their relationship, or their leagues and their relationship with the MLS, the professional team, you could start to see how, you know, this team actually had a shot in doing that. But I think long term, and I don't know if Ethan, you have a different opinion here, but I think that the monetary return is definitely there. For us, it's about essentially locking up exclusivity and rising in rank and being the team for San Francisco and buying the rights to basically play for San Francisco for the next 5 to 10 years. And that's really where the unique insight, the differential value, and how to basically win those rights came into play with the investment.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo Scott. I mean, Jock, don't listen to this for a second. For me, it's more about the pride of ownership of a team that is supporter-owned by the city. It's majority supporter-owned by San Francisco, and it's more than just sort of a for-profit venture to try to deliver a return to shareholders. It's about creating this movement of soccer within San Francisco that's already there and has a rich history going back a decade or more. Taking that, marrying that with what'll be a company that supports the growth of soccer in San Francisco, but stays true to its roots as a supporter-owned club that will take that and hopefully give San Francisco a great team to cheer for at the same time. So it's less about, for me, I think if we do those things well, it'll be a great return for all of us, but it was more about supporting this movement that can be really big, and to kind of our earlier framing around this discussion, a lot of it is market timing for soccer and the white space that exists here where there's just not, there aren't any professional soccer franchises, and there's this team that's really well positioned to take that mantle. So when you have the intersection of something that's good, something that should exist, and a lot of tailwinds for the whole professional soccer community, that felt like a great opportunity to me. And I think the monetary piece will fall into place if we're successful in that, but that's not the primary driver.
Got it. Guys, we're going to do questions from the audience in a sec, so get those questions germinating. I was going to ask one more question for you. Yeah. Who's going to win? The question is, so Ned, so you've invested in a bunch of stuff as an angel. You're obviously pretty passionate about the space. Whether you want to talk about one of your existing investments or something that you're excited about, like it sounds like obviously coaching's one area that you feels like ripe.
So I'll just
go for it.
Yeah, so with coaching, I'm a former player, high school and college, right? And so you think basketball was my sport, but then you have kids, and you think because you know basketball, you should be able to coach basketball, which is two totally different things when you start having a bunch of 8-year-olds in a huddle in the last 2 minutes of a game, right? And so I learned a lot of things the hard way about all of a sudden you have these parents who work 40, 60, 80 hours a week who are trying to do the right thing, volunteering for a Little League team or a basketball team or a soccer team. And they're really these deputized coaches who have no idea how to run a practice, what drills to do, how to layer things in over the course of a season. For basketball, it's out-of-bounds plays, et cetera. And again, I don't think these are billion-dollar businesses, but I think there's a lot of app opportunities and things out there that just solve real problems out there for people who are trying to do the right thing and play these sports. And so there's a number of things like that. There's a number of things about helping high school kids get recruited. The vast majority of college athletes play D2 and D3 sports, and generally not the big three. And just how do you get on the map? How do you find the right school that fits you and stuff like that? I'm looking for investments that have good problem founder fit and solve those real problems I faced as a player and coach.
Got it. Thanks, and enjoy the game.
All right, thank you. Sorry. You
Yeah.
can share my contact info with somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll pass it on. Okay. All right. So to hear from the rest of the audience, what questions do you guys have for these guys? Yeah. So the question is, are there any stories of pre-revenue companies that I guess you guys helped to get funding more or less or supported?
I also do gaming investments outside of specific media, and so there was a period of time where I was pitched on lots of sports gaming concepts that I thought were quite cool. But you try to invest where you think you have some insight into, you think you have an ability to determine a winner in gaming. It is impossible before the app gets launched. I mean, any VC or investor that tells you they have some insight into consumer psychology that's going to play a game is deluding themselves. I would submit. So lots of sports games that I didn't fund, some of which went on to get funding, others didn't. Kabam started out that way, and there I can't remember all the names of them, but lots of pretty interesting concepts that I passed on.
Okay, next question. Okay, questions about future of gambling in the U.S.
Well, I'm like the lowest guy on the food chain in that company, so they don't even give me updates.
It's a political question. I don't know.
Yeah. I can tell you how we think about it. I think a lot of people are of the thought process that they should stay away from gambling entirely, right, based on regulation, legislation. I think there is an opportunity for sure when you look at technology as it stands today. Our tech in gambling has been happening for years, right? You see social casinos being bought. You go to a casino itself, and it's completely decked out, like it's very technologically advanced. It really, to his point, comes down to what the market looks like from a legislative standpoint. I personally believe that states will start mandating, at least on the DFS side. Things are pointing in that direction. Some states have already done it. Time will tell. I mean, I think there are a lot of interesting opportunities on the periphery of the gambling world that don't necessarily do the transactions themselves, but offer resources and values to people who might be taking part in gaming, gambling, or other forms.
Next question. Is soccer here to stay?
I'll just say one thing real quick. The U.S. winning in the World Cup. I mean, we see something fundamentally different when the U.S. wins and kids that are 6, 7 years old who hadn't played for the past 4 or 5 years or maybe didn't even think about soccer as an option are now starting to play because Dempsey jerseys are all over the place, right? And so I think winning actually has a massive part to do in soccer's, I wouldn't say resurgence, but the buildup of soccer. And MLS has done a phenomenal job. I think they just hit 20 years. So I think winning makes a big difference here.
Sorry to interrupt. I'd be really interested, by the way, just because you said that, as you probably both say that soccer is here to stay, can you add, do you think, as supporters of a league other than MLS, which is a very closed structure, particularly compared to European leagues, do you guys think MLS has done a great job? And what sort of from your viewpoint, might change if you don't?
I'll let Scott comment on the MLS question. I don't know. I mean, but I do. It's a really good question, right? And I don't know the answer definitively. It's not because it's a personal investment. I don't sort of study it the level of rigor I might if I was recommending it to my partners at Bessemer. But it does feel that way. And certainly, if you go back and you think about the disconnect between people playing soccer and soccer as a professional sports franchise that people go and watch, it feels pretty massive. I mean, most kids grow up with some soccer involved in their life, but yet they immediately go and watch football once they, are watching sports as entertainment. And so it does. You look at the statistics. It does seem like the NFL is peaking a little bit, maybe even slight decline or diminishing returns there, and that there is room for a new franchise. Hard to say whether it's going to be soccer or not, but I think if you look at the trends, it would suggest that winning in the World Cup and all the other things is making that happen. Now, I don't know if the MLS is well set up or not, but Scott has an opinion there, I'm sure.
Well, I think it starts at the youth level. So I definitely think the youth numbers in general are on the rise, and a lot of that is created from the U.S. winning and also them having, or being part of a passionate fan base locally with MLS clubs. So that's one thing. Pop Warner is on the decline, and parents are more hesitant to put their son or daughter into like a full contact sport versus soccer, although that can be pretty physical as well. I had season tickets to the New England Revolution when the MLS first started, and there were probably 2,000 people in the stands. And you could buy a franchise for $5 million. Now the average MLS franchise is worth about $150 million, with the Sounders being worth about $250 million, and that's only in the course of 15 years or so. And so, I mean, that's a massive, rise. And even in the league that SF City's in, and the league that we're about to go into, which is basically the AAA baseball of the soccer community, those teams are now worth 10 to 20 million, and it's a minor league team. And so people are taking a huge interest in it, and I think, part of the value going up is, from the youth interest up, but also, they're getting bigger TV contracts and media deals, which never really happened before. And also, the Premier League and the interest in international soccer in the United States is also something that's really helped. The NBC deal with Premier League and others have basically just brought soccer into the living room to millions and millions of Americans, and that's really helped, I think, MLS as well, which I'm not sure if they were a part of promoting that, but that's had a huge ripple effect, I think. And circling back to the MLS question, I think that they've done a really good job of adopting the model of soccer for America in the major league sort of concept. I know that there's many people out there that want to see something like the English Premier League, where teams can get promoted and then demoted based on their record and connecting the leagues. That's not a reality right now because people are investing so much in stadiums and infrastructure and sort of making it happen. But hopefully someday that can be a reality, and that'll really help the game, I think.
Sally? Got it. So what are investment opportunities in the amateur and recreational sports?
So there's a lot of opportunity. There's a ton of fragmentation that exists in the market around youth sports. There's some great companies out there that are going after the youth, the high school. So you have stuff like Crossover, you have league apps, you have a lot of folks that are going after this, getting someone in the funnel and then effectively working alongside them or working with them and keeping them through as they develop and as they get older. I think there is, the hardest part of youth sports is the sales side, right? So there are, millions of youth athletes. There are, I imagine tens of thousands of coaches. There are tens of thousands of high schools. So how do you get in front of them? It's not cheap. It's very capital intensive, I think, to go and build out a sales force and really go after them. But there's still a huge opportunity. I mean, I don't think anyone has won the space by any means. So I think we were talking about this earlier. Streaming, as it pertains to come back to user-generated content side, I think there's an opportunity for parents to be able to view their children's games remotely. There's an interesting company called ScoreStream, which effectively has enabled folks to crowdsource high school games, if you will. So a local newspaper reporter doesn't have to go there anymore, and it's a cost savings. And if you look at the feed, it's literally people who are manually inputting the scores, and it's pretty accurate. So I think there are a lot of opportunities as it comes down to the participatory side, especially technology to help create a better experience for both the kids and the parents.
Were you going to say something?
No, I mean, I wish I had the knowledge of what entrepreneurs were doing in that area to answer your question. But if I was going to look in one area, I think technology has the potential to make our enjoyment of participating in sports better, either through making us better at them or giving us context or community around the sport we're playing. And so I don't know who's doing that, but I'm surprised, frankly, that I don't, right? That there aren't big companies that are dedicated to the angle of making us better at sports or giving us a better experience through the participation in sports. So I'm assuming lots of people are working on that, but nothing comes to my mind, so probably suggest there's some room.
Can I just ask, how many people here are working on something in youth sports? And all participatory youth sports?
That's
right.
That's good news.
Awesome.
I think like building on what she was saying is that it's just interesting. You don't see a lot of investment happening in the space, but even this weekend being in a grassroots tournament, and that's where you see it, the shift happening from high school sports to grassroots sports, specifically in basketball. Football, you see the blowout about satellite camps happening now. Volleyball is huge. You have 5,000 players in the city at one time, and these kids are celebrities online. You look at their accounts, they have 3,000, 5,000 followers. They're pushing, what's happening in sports. And you don't see a lot of investment happening where companies that are playing in those areas, and there aren't a lot of companies that are in those areas. Again, being in those gyms, a lot of the things that they're still using, you see them writing on the wall scores, the players, you don't know who's playing, but these guys are, it's just huge. And you don't see a lot happening in the space, which is odd to me, just because there's a lot to capitalize off of there.
I'll just add to that real quick. I think there's investment happening in this space, just not extremely early. So I think once companies reach a certain inflection point, they can be pretty profitable businesses. I think the fear amongst a lot of investors in the really early stage space is, how do you scale, right? How do you become this really large company by going after the high school market? Because it's hard to market to kids. You have to market to parents a lot of the time. Social media has obviously helped that a lot. There's a company that's going through 500 startups right now called Marsreel, which is pretty interesting, which, you get a text message and you get a highlight or a clip from a high school athlete around the country, and it's really engaging. It's really cool. So I think stuff like that helps create more exposure for athletes, to your point, has a lot of opportunity, and preferably something that's not necessarily professional content, but more UGC. Like, how are you creating more of a community where people are being discovered and you're seeing or discovering talent that you might not otherwise have seen before?
You know, traditionally, kids were a really hard customer, right? Because they just don't have a lot of spending power. Some do, but generally they can't, write the kind of checks, or they're not as valuable an advertising audience because of just the limits of their purchasing power. But that is changing a bit if you look at, apps that are sort of enable kids to buy things. And so I suspect we will be able to access more of that market without going through the parent in the future. As kind of scary, I have 2 young kids, as scary as it is to say that, I think there probably is more of a democratization where parents do spend lots of money on their kids, but it's more, the entryway has been parents, and I think in the future that may change a bit. So that may be the change that's needed to unlock that market, hopefully.
Can I just add one thing real quick that I think something that we've learned, especially from the youth and participatory side, is building a platform from scratch is really hard. Definitely not saying you shouldn't do it, but look for different channel partnerships. There are a lot of people or brands that already have access to this demographic of youth, high school. They don't have to be the Nikes or Under Armours of the world, but they could be a really good way for you to get in. Maybe you become their reseller for what you're doing. So look towards stuff that may not necessarily be directly in your target zone, but has access to the same audience demographic, and see if you can leverage that as opposed to having to spend a ton of money on acquiring customers or trying to get in front of the kids.
Kate? So the question is opportunities for wearables and other, I guess, personal sensor-based companies.
We have an investment in one. I'm glad you asked the question because I didn't connect the dots until you did. But we have an investment in one called Ohm Signal, where it's sort of a body sensing shirt that gives you some telemetry data on your heart rate and your breathing and things like that. So tremendous opportunity there, right? Because the sensors, you think sensor tech was sort of clumsy in the past. I remember a friend of mine from high school was working on this golf swing detector, basically, and it was like stepping into a room that had to have 47 different cameras to be able to provide this sort of not that great experience where it sort of simulated how you were going to strike the ball. Probably the return on that investment for the individual user buying it, probably not that high. Sensor tech has gotten so good now, so good that these little sensors that go on our clothing, eventually into our bodies, can provide much more payoff for a lot less cost and cumbersomeness. So I don't know what it'll be, but certainly there's room for more than Fitbit and Apple Watch. There's no question about that. And the question will always be, like, what's the ratio of cost and sort of ease of use to utility? And once the costs come down and things get easy to use and utility goes up, there'll be lots of markets opened up by that kind of stuff.
Okay, last few questions. Right here.
It's just kind of a follow-up with that. What I've seen is there's a lot that are going into the healthcare space, too, so that just really broadens the market. And once you enter the sports market with these kind of wearables and Internet of Things, then it just goes into the healthcare market. And that seems to be the big space. That's where you kind of want to fit in when you're into sports. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll, just adding to what Ethan said, I think the wearables are not necessarily the easiest, so wearing some around your wrist, I don't know if that's the form factor that wins ultimately. I think the connected clothing and the sensor-based clothing is really interesting, becomes a part of your experience, right? So of your daily habits. In terms of the kind of carryover to healthcare, I think that's a huge opportunity. So not necessarily even just fitness, but health and wellness in general. So we invest in a company that effectively allows you to, for pain relief, right? And so it's a really interesting technology around that. But if you look at the market traditionally, I mean, there are a million ways to get pain relief, but it's not necessarily the most accessible, not the most technologically advanced. people generally can't afford it on a consumer level. So as to his point, as the prices come down, I think health becomes even way more relevant as it pertains to the consumer side.
Last couple of questions. Fan Cave?
Okay. So I want to understand, like, your past few investments. What are the few past sports tech investments you guys have made, especially Courtside, and what metric or highlights that kind of made you make that investment decision? I think it applies to Ethan. I saw your lead investment in Twitch. What did you see in Twitch and Series B that we all know about Twitch now in Series B?
Yeah.
Well, Twitch was interesting because it was so quirky that nobody really got it, including me, right? And so, but if you just stripped away, I mean, I'm not I had some gaming investments, so I understood gaming a little bit, but I'm not a hardcore gamer. But if you stripped away, I mean, I've invested a lot of stuff in video, and online video is a tremendous transformational trend if you think about cord cutting and people moving from like cable television controlled by certain big players to just over the top, over the internet, watching video content. That was the trend we were riding with Twitch, absolutely. And the rise of esports was just kind of the enabler for that. And so you looked at Twitch, there were two things. A lot of folks didn't quite get it. And so the result was a video community of 19 million people watching 2 hours of content a day. It's like any site that got to that scale now would have 4,000 venture capitalists like knocking down their door. But because this was in this quirky area of esports, it was not mainstream, a lot of people dismissed it as probably a fad, or people just didn't allow themselves to look at the metrics underneath and realize that like the underlying metrics of this business were incredibly good. The other thing working against them, so to speak, was that they spun out of Justin TV that was just a ton of pirated content and other content that was just inherently not monetizable. But from within that, they had this, again, 19 million people a month watching hours of content a day. There's just no question that's going to be tremendously valuable and was growing. And so that was there was no brilliance in it. It was just sort of luck that I happened to look a little deeper and see those metrics, and a lot of people dismissed it.
So in terms of a few recent investments, so we're a fairly new fund, but a couple that kind of stand out. One is here in San Francisco, maybe a handful you've heard of, called vSporto. So Keith, who runs that, was an interesting business, again, tying back to the audio space, where they build a really interesting business where as early as they don't necessarily need to go after rights per se. So they're doing a lot of stuff around shoulder programming. So not necessarily the game itself, but there's a rabid fan base for a lot of the large teams here in the U.S. and overseas, and people constantly want to consume a lot of content about their team. And so they build a good business around that. We invest in a company called the Drone Racing League. They are, the founder's phenomenal. He's really smart. What was interesting to us about them was they're fully vertically integrated, right? They build their drone, they're building a league, they own the events, and they own the media. And the media is really, really captivating content. And so it's a new league, it's a new sport for the most part, right? Traditionally, people had just done this for hobbyist purposes. But we saw a pretty big opportunity there, invested in a streaming platform that is, geared towards interactive behaviors in esports. And again, to Ethan's point, I mean, the biggest metric for us is engagement, right? It's hard to argue with something where people are spending hours a day on. Whether we fully believe it or understand it or know the market, there's an allure, right? Like, what is driving these people? Even if it's not 50 million people, even if it's 10,000 or 100,000, you know that there's an opportunity there. So that's something we're always looking for.
Okay, any last questions? All right, here you go.
I'm a New England Patriots fan, so my question is to the Patriots fans specifically.
Yeah.
I personally was very upset that they didn't win the Super Bowl, given the Deflategate story, the Peyton Manning story. So the way I dealt with it, I created a style called Sport Fiction, and we're publishing a book called Super Bowl 50, New England Patriots, your champions. This book will be released soon. What do you think about it?
When is it released?
Soon. End of the month.
I'll buy a copy.
Genius.
Okay.
I'm in. Does this delusion extend to other people? Or I like your strategy.
I don't think there's anybody doing anything in this market.
Yeah. I was always a Matt Christopher fan growing up, so I like that. All right. Apparently a few others. All right, guys. Thank you so much to everyone. This was great. Big thanks to the panelists. Big thanks to Sports Radar. Big thanks to Bleacher Report. Hang out, have a beer, have some pizza, watch a Warriors game. Thanks again.